Hello and welcome to another episode of Red Inker. I'm on my own. Well, I'm with myself. I'm doing this podcast with me, is what I'm trying to say. A solo episode, because I wanted to talk about why Harry Brook was not selected. Because I think the obvious thing, and we will discuss that throughout the podcast, is the whole thing about Ben Stokes coming back and how that pushed Harry Brook out of the squad. But I actually think there's a lot more interesting thing here, for instance, the way that England select their teams, but also this other major factor that I really wanted to talk about. But I think the first one is that England has player roles. And for instance, we know that they want Butler to come in around the 30th over, maybe 35th over. They want to start attacking those last 5 overs or so when the field is still up slightly, or there's an extra fielder in the circle, and then completely go nuts from that point. And that would be a really good role for Harry Brook. But at the moment, there's no reason to have a backup in the squad for that player because they already have Livingston, who is there for other reasons. You know, Livingston gives them flexibility with spin bowling, of course, in that sort of environment. And so, if something does happen to Butler and in the last minute, it would make sense for Livingston to come in. Also, then Livingston can help them out if they need a third spinner. I personally think his spin bowling is quite weak, but you could see why England would say, well, he could spin it in both different directions, and if Moeen Ali's not particularly working, or we just want to have someone to match with Moeen Ali, Livingston makes a lot more sense. So Brook can't do any of that. With all due respect to Harry Brook's incredible bowling, probably not going to get as many overs, in that particular World Cup from the slow medium pace stylings that he has. So that's the most obvious role that he would have been in the squad for, as Butler's backup. But there is already a player there. So then you go to the rest of the team. And if you look at their batting, you know, England attack very hard at the top. That's not something that Brook is going to do, at least at this stage in his career. And they have recommitted to Roy, probably until the end of this World Cup, if we're being honest. And obviously Bairstow. Bairstow, again, does 2 different roles because he can wicket keep as well. And then England have this machine, as I've been calling it, in the middle, which is really what changed their one-day cricket as much as, you know, that and the all-rounders, I think, are the things that change their one-day cricket the most, which is Root, Stokes and Morgan, traditionally, batting in the middle of those ODI games and scoring at around a run a ball, but with very high averages. So they don't go out and they score quicker than most other teams do. And some other teams have 1 player who can do this, or maybe 1.5 or 2 if they're lucky. To have 3 the way that England has had is a huge part of their success. It means their openers can go harder, right? And it also means that because they're not just making 35 off at a run of ball, they're averaging 45, 50, 60 sometimes in those middle overs, which means that they're still not out towards the end of the 40 over mark as well, so they can kick on when they're being set. So there's a lot of different advantages there. Then you have So that's pretty much Roy, Bairstow, Root, Morgan, which is now Dawid Malan, who's, let's be honest, done really, really well in ODI cricket in this role. In fact, if you look at his numbers, I think he's averaging well over 100 with the bat in the middle overs of ODIs from a limited sample size, but he's done it enough now, and also striking at more than a run a ball. So he's doing his job. There's absolutely no problem with that. And obviously Stokes will come back as that number 5 that he was very, very good at as well. You then have one other specialist batter in the squad, which is Jos Buttler, who will bat at number 6 or will come in around that 30-35 over mark. And then you have the 2 batting all-rounders, assuming we still believe that Moeen Ali is a batting all-rounder, but him and Liam Livingstone are the other 2 batting all-rounders. This is where I think there's a key issue. There's only 6 specialist batters there. So if you had Brook in that squad, you are talking about then 7 specialist batters. And there is a reason why they only have 6 specialist batters in that squad. And that is because they don't really rate their bowling all that much. So Liam Livingstone won't bowl all that much. Moeen Ali, I think the general thought when I've talked to people around the England camp is they would prefer he didn't have to bowl his 10 overs. Not that he can't, and certainly in India, they would hope that he'll be able to do it in quite a few different situations, but they don't want to be in a situation where they have to do that. What they want is other bowling options available to them. And if you look, they've got they've got 1 specialist spinner in the squad in Adil Rashid, and then they have 3 all-rounders in Sam Curran, Chris Wokes, and David Willey. All those guys can bowl in the power play. Curran's probably the best of those guys at the death, although he can be very, very hit, player of the tournament in the last World Cup, or very, very miss. But with those guys, they have some batting, and they have, the ability to, all three of them can certainly bowl with the new ball. Then you've got Mark Wood, who they want to play in that Liam Plunkett role, right? Of just coming in and whacking the ball into the middle of the pitch. I would think that in a perfect world, England would probably only pick one player in their squad to do that. And then they would have, and then if that player got injured, they would try and bring someone in at the last moment. Because it's Wood, I think that is why we see Atkinson also in the squad. But on top of that, we do have Atkinson and we have Reece Topley. And I think there is a part of which they do think that Atkinson and Reece Topley will be able to help them a little bit more at the death if the all-rounders, if they do pick 2 or 3 of the all-rounders and they struggle a little bit. Wood's not always been good at the death either, right? Essentially, they have 6 specialist batters, 2 batting all-rounders, and then they have 7 other bowling options. And I think, the main reason for that is they just don't trust their bowling. They don't have Jofra Archer who can lock down both ends of the innings for them. They can't believe that Mark Wood's going to be fit all the time. And so they do have extra bowling options. And again, Brook might have been in the squad. There might have been another team in this tournament where you didn't need so many bowling options available to you. And so for that sort of team, Brook would have been the one who would have just come in. Generally, teams do have extra seam bowlers in their backups. It's not... Seam bowlers get injured more. They get injured in the warm-ups quite often. They don't get out of bed very well. You're more likely to have a seam bowler as your backup. But it does feel, looking at England, that they have a massive amount of bowlers in that particular squad. When you think that there are probably, 7 bowling options plus whatever Root and Livingston bring to that as well. There's a lot of different bowling available to them, but I'm also not even sure what they would think at the moment is their best bowling lineup, right? And so all these things, Livingston being able to bowl a little bit, Stokes making a comeback and already having done that job better. Also the fact that Brook hasn't played much List A cricket. I think he has less than 20 games to his name, if I remember the number correctly. 3 of those have been one-day internationals. There is a chance that as they go forward and they look at the way that he plays, that he might have a role in that sort of 4 and 5 area. And perhaps they'll play it differently. Rather than having someone like Morgan or Milan, they might have someone a little, who's a bit more of a... Maybe can average 40, but at a strike rate of 120, a sort of Glenn Maxwell number 4, but in one-day cricket rather than T20 cricket. But they haven't prepared for this World Cup as well as they prepared for 2019. They're basically taking the exact same sort of plan in, and they haven't tried as many players. Well, I should say, they haven't got the same sort of role definition that they did have before. And so they're in a situation where they're going with what works for them. The bowling, I think, makes sense to have the extra bowler in the squad for them because they don't feel as comfortable. I think that if you were being completely honest, you don't need Willie, Atkinson and Topley. You could have 2 of those 3 rather than all 3. But when you do go through the England squad specifically and the bowlers that they have, you can understand why they want backups for the new ball position or rounder position, why they want a backup for Wood, and also why they probably need someone who they can trust at the death. So that, I think, explains why he's not there. This is all subjective, right? And, you could sit there and tell me that he's the next KP and he's going to be a transformative player. I don't think you can argue that he's good at one-day cricket yet, because I don't think he knows he's good at one-day cricket yet. And we also don't know what kind of player he's going to be anyway. But you can certainly make the suggestion that him being in that squad, if they do need a little bit more firepower, or they do want to, change up their style, or they just even get a little bit flat or a little bit too predictable because teams now know a lot more about them as one-day cricket. I think Brook does give them that sort of, think about a young Inzamam Al-Haq in the 92 World Cup. Sort of everyone knew what Pakistan was going to do, and then they had this other player who came in and didn't quite fit that. It's very possible you could be in a situation like that with someone like Brook. But they trust in their batting. And their batting is what they have built their success on. And they're basically saying, more or less, unless someone is actually unable to play, this is going to be our batting lineup, and we trust it to win us another World Cup, or at least put us in a position to be able to do that, right? But as I said, this is just normal selection stuff. And selecting teams is very, very hard. And the truth is, and I say this a lot when we talk about selection, and I got this from Nathan Lehman, who might have even been involved in this selection decision by England here, is that the last player that you pick is usually the one who's going to have the least amount of impact. Now, that is the case when you were talking about a Test 11 or a T20 11 or a one-day 11. It's even more the case when you're talking about a squad member who was going to start outside the starting team. He wasn't going to be in this team. We know that because he wasn't picked in the squad, but we also know that because they brought Stokes back specifically to fill the role that he had been filling before. So there was no chance that Brook was going to be in that squad. So it's not to say, in that team. So it's not to say that he wouldn't have had an impact, because I don't think that's necessarily true. But it is to say that the difference between that and perhaps picking, let's say, any of the three of Willie, Atkinson, and Topley, is that they know they are going to have some issues with the bowling at one stage in this tournament, or at least they're assuming that's going to be their bigger problem. And so they are willing to gamble on fixing that rather than Brook. And if Brook wasn't going to be in the actual starting 11 anyway, they were probably thinking that they just didn't need a backup like him. Livingston makes more sense. All the other batters, as I said, people like Milan and Stokes can probably pinch open. Butler maybe can pinch open as well. Root could probably pinch open as well. Whereas Brook probably has to bat at 5 or 6. And the way that England play, it's probably going to be at number 6. He just doesn't give them as much flexibility as even Livingston does with his little spinners. So that's a selection issue, and that's fine. And you can disagree with England if you want. But I don't think you can disagree with the fact that if he was going to be the 15th player in or out of the squad anyway, he probably wasn't going to get as many opportunities. The truth is that all those things I've said, Livingston's bowling, Stokes being a great number 5, and the problem with England's bowling and not being as sure of themselves, especially without Jofra Archer available, or Ben Stokes being able to bowl some overs in the middle, it's just one part of it. These things happen all the time. But the reason that Brook is not in this World Cup squad is essentially because the ICC has decided over a long period of time to have teeny tiny World Cup squads. And it doesn't make as much sense, right? You're talking about in 1975, they had 14 players in a World Cup squad. Now, I think at that stage, it probably made a bit of sense. That would have been around about the average touring squad of a test nation if they were playing, 3 or 4 or 5 tests. It's not a lot of people, but it's how cricket rolled for a long period of time. And that 14-man squad actually lasted until 1999. That's the first tournament we see the 15-man squad, right? And we are now so many years, almost 50 years from 1975. And when they started, it was incredibly amateur. They played 4 games on the first day, for instance. It was a very, very weird tournament to begin with. And they didn't really know what they were doing. They went with the norms of that time. Well, the norms of this time would dictate it's now a $1 billion event. And not only is it a $1 billion event, but we now have even test squads are far bigger than that. Sorry. Oh, God. Even test squads are now far bigger than that, right? Not to mention that A teams sometimes tour. Teams tour with net bowlers and all sorts of things. It's not even just the rich teams. It's just a thing that happens in cricket now. And so if you're still looking at 1999, God, why can I not just sneeze this out? And so if you're still looking at 1975 or 1996, the 14-man squad, cricket is entirely different now. There's so much more money. It's so much more professional. And to think that all we've done is added 1 extra player to the squad size. I looked up football because I didn't know this off the top of my head, obviously. Football has 23 people in their World Cup squads. and they have 11 players on the pitch and they have 3 substitutes. So that's still 9 extra players, which gives you as much flexibility as you would need in a World Cup squad to do so many different tactical things. T20 cricket, of course. There are squads that are 15 people. There are squads that are 16, 17, 18, up until I think it's 24 or 25, which is the IPL. I think 18 is a perfectly reasonable number to jump it from at the moment. I would say that would give you a lot more flexibility. You could certainly try a few more things. And one of the reasons I'm saying this, it's not that I particularly think Brook would play. In fact, I'm not even sure if you had a squad of 18, Brook would get used that much. Perhaps you would use him in a dead rubber game if your team was already doing quite well. Or perhaps if you might have a situation where you want to rest Butler, but you don't necessarily want him, you still want to replace him with a similar kind of player. You might bring Brook in. Or they could play terribly and need Brook, but that's a separate one. They're obviously not planning for that. But the point would be here is that if you had 18, you then become more of a tactical sport. And if you have 15 people in, you're really looking at injury replacements, right? You can make 1 or 2 small tactical changes to your team. And if you look at India, they've got 5 spinners, essentially, or 6 if you want to count Bishnoi as well. But five sort of frontline white ball spinners available to them. They're obviously going to go Akshar Patel and Ravi Jadeja because of the batting. I don't think they can really overlook that, but it gives them other issues. For instance, they don't want to then have another finger spinner in the squad. So Ashwin misses out, right? They also, Chahal spins the ball away from right-handers, the same that Jadeja and Akshar does. So now they're in a similar situation. They don't want 3 spinners who spin the ball all in one direction, so they've gone with Kuldeep. That's absolutely fine, and that might be how the final 11s break out. But there are going to be pitches where they might want Kuldeep and Chahal to play. There are going to be situations, there might be a bunch of left-handers where you want Ashwin to play. India's team can actually be improved by having players who are not even in the squad play for them. And isn't that what you want? You want the cricket to be at its absolute best. And I don't want this to just sound like it's a England or India or, perhaps Australia problem. Ireland came to the last T20 World Cup in Australia knowing that they would probably need more seam than spin. And so they only brought 1 spinner with them, which meant that Andy McBride, who'd obviously, transformed himself as a cricketer, didn't even get in the squad. Now, perhaps he doesn't play anyway, but they didn't have the opportunity to have someone like Andy McBride, right? That is the real issue here, is that there is no lineup flexibility, even for one of the smaller test nations. And once you get to the higher level, that's kind of what you're looking at. And I look at it in the way of that. We hear one of the justifications for having a smaller World Cup is that we have the best quality teams playing in it, right? We don't have the filler teams and all this sort of stuff. And yet, we're going to have a World Cup where Ashwin, Chahal, and Brook probably don't play a game unless there's an injury or something, changes at the last minute. Just because the squad size. There's no reason that these guys couldn't be going with their teams. If it was a test tour, they might be going. If it was a bilateral series, they might take extra players. It's purely based on the fact that we started with 14. At one stage, we moved to 15, and no one's actually changed that. And it's laziness. It's silly. And I don't really understand how it helps the World Cup be the best tournament that it can be. There's no doubt that when you break it down, I think, Ben Stokes played his part in Brook's non-selection, as did the bowlers, and also the batting just being so good, right? England don't feel they need as many backup options in the batting because they know more or less what they're going to get. But I can't help shake the feeling that Brook, and you can throw Ashwin and Chahal in this as well, are basically squeezed out by a rule that seems to exist because no one's really asked the question about it as much as anything. And I do remember having a chat with someone from the ICC about this. And when I put it to him, there was this blankness of, that's a fair point. And the truth is that I would say, I'd be shocked if I'm the first person to bring this up, with the ICC or within the ICC before. And I would guess that the big reason, or one of the big reasons that they have done this, is that the ICC just don't want to pay for flights and accommodation for 3 more people per team. And no one's asking the question, right? But as we get to one-day cricket being more matchup driven, as we get to, the tactical side of cricket being more important than, just having a backup wicket keeper in your squad automatically and all those sorts of things. If this is supposed to be the best players in the world going up against the best players in the world, shouldn't you give yourself that flexibility in the squad? Shouldn't there be a deeper, you don't want your backup batter to be someone who can open or can bat at number 7, and that's why he's in the side, despite the fact you might have a better backup opener and a better backup number 7 at home, right? You want this to be the best of the best. You want the World Cup to rise up and be a huge, huge showcase of the best players in the world. And perhaps Ashwin Chahal, Brook, whoever else, are probably, left out some other players. And the truth is, if you move the squad to my 18, players will still miss out. If you move it to 24, players will still miss out. These things will still happen. But we will have more availability of the top players in the world in any one tournament. And at the moment, I just don't see any reason other than saving a little bit on airfares and accommodation, which at $1 billion event makes no sense to me. Just put them in the squad. Enlarge the squad. Make more players out there. I don't think it's going to change anyone's enjoyment of a World Cup in a major way, right? But I do think that the cricket will be slightly better. And I think that it is silly to just follow an old tradition that doesn't really need to be there anymore. T20 has already shown us the way forward. Test cricket has even showed us that bigger squads should be out there. It would give better narrative lines from everyone else, and maybe it doesn't enhance the enjoyment of overall fans that much. But the cricket will be better, and the narratives will be better, and there'll be more players in the squad. I think overall it would be a huge improvement to a tournament. And the only argument against it is that we've always had smaller squad sizes in cricket. And if that's the case, well, we always did, and we don't anymore.